Thank you so much. For Barry and us, we really appreciate the appreciation that you've shown for our work, this labor of love that took 3 years. Okay, great. So one motivation for this paper comes from a negotiations class that I teach at Penn, where I'm regularly asked a question for which I have no answer, for which the literature doesn't really seem to have much of an answer. Arguably the most fundamental question in bargaining or negotiation, which is, what offer should I make? So we're going to try to answer that question in a very specific context, that of best offer listings on eBay. So you may know about eBay as a place to buy random junk from somebody's attic. That's largely true. You may also think about eBay as a place to buy that junk at auction. That's no longer largely true. So most listings on eBay are fixed price listings, where the seller lists an item, here a very nice antique brass urn, for some list price, $225. You can click buy it now and have this urn shipped to you quickly. Increasingly, these fixed price listings have this best offer feature, so this make offer button that you see at the bottom. You can click this button and offer something less than the list price and go back and forth with the seller until you either agree or agree to disagree. So I was browsing eBay, and I came across this brass urn from an archbishop home. I was looking for, how much you say it, a more modestly priced receptacle. Fortunately, I found this Folgers coffee can, which actually came out of a garage attic, is in very good condition. So let me be specific about what we're trying to accomplish. We want to find the offer that maximizes the eventual payoff, and I'll be clear about what I mean by payoff later on. For any listing that is for this antique brass urn, or for the Folgers coffee can, or any of the hundreds of millions of other things that are sold on eBay, at any point in the negotiation, separately for the buyer and the seller, and we want, this is important, we want to learn best responses to humans on eBay. So we want to learn strategies that exploit the way that humans play this game. So when I talk about optimal, I'm not talking about an equilibrium strategy, I'm just talking about a static best response. So obviously the downside of this is that once you see what this agent is doing, it won't be too hard to figure out how to exploit it. But the benefit for us researchers is that this strategy is going to highlight ways in which humans make mistakes, in ways in which those humans can then improve, humans like ourselves. So the set of tools that we're going to use to solve this problem are broadly called reinforcement learning algorithms, and they're designed to find a mapping between some state of the world, from that state to an action that maximizes a potentially distant reward. So many of you know how reinforcement learning has been used to play chess. In chess, the state is the board position, the action is a move, and you want to take a move to maximize your chances of winning. For eBay, the state is defined by what's observable about the listing, as well as the offer history up to this point, and we want to take an action that is make an offer that maximizes some payoff at the end of the negotiation. So the way you train one of these algorithms is you have it act more or less randomly initially, but then it reinforces actions that lead to desirable outcomes. Okay, so moves in chess that lead to wins, offers that lead to high payoffs. So ideally what we would do is we would just train this algorithm directly on eBay. We'd launch it on eBay, have it make offers, and then reinforce the types of offers that lead to good outcomes. But these algorithms are very data hungry. They require millions or tens of millions of actions in order to converge to a strategy that's superhuman. So obviously doing something directly on eBay like that is infeasible. So what we do instead is we simulate eBay. So we train a series of neural networks to mimic the behavior of human buyers and sellers in a massive data set of best offer listings. And then in that environment, we inject our reinforcement learning agent and have it learn to play optimally against either these simulated buyers or sellers. Okay, so the crux of what we're doing depends on having a good simulator. So I'm going to spend some time up front trying to convince you that our simulator is in fact good. And then I'm going to talk about what our agent seller does to exploit these simulated buyers. I'm not going to have time to talk about the agent buyer, but the results are in the paper for anybody who's curious. Okay, so this is how best offer listings on eBay worked about 10 years ago when the data were collected. So the seller sets a list price, and if the buyer comes along and clicks buy it now, they get the item at the list price. If the buyer makes an offer for less than the list price, well, the seller can accept, in which case the negotiation's over. They can reject, or they can make a counteroffer. And the buyer and the seller can go back and forth, making up to 3 offers each. After the seller makes their final, their third offer, the buyer faces a take it or leave it decision. Okay, so the game tree is arbitrarily sliced at 7 turns. What's nice about this context is in practice, there's so many sellers and buyers that when we see a seller-buyer interaction, it's almost always unique, which allows us to think about this game as a one-shot game rather than a more complicated repeated game. Okay, so let's go back to this antique brass urn, and maybe in the data what happened is that the first buyer showed up and clicked buy it now, and it sold for $225. But imagine that we rewound time and pressed play, and maybe something else happened. Maybe the first buyer shows up and offers $150. And the seller's thinking about that offer, but while he or she is thinking about that offer, another buyer comes and clicks buy it now. Okay, so it sells to the second buyer for the list price. So those are the types of counterfactuals that we want to simulate because they allow us to say, well, what if our agent had done something that we didn't observe in the data? What if our agent had offered $150 instead of click buy it now? Okay, so how are we going to do that? So for any listing, what we do is we simulate the arrival path of buyers, and then we simulate for each buyer the offer path along that thread, where a thread is just a buyer-seller interaction. Everything about the listing, including importantly the list price, we're going to hold fixed, as well as everything about the seller, like their experience. We're just going to take those features from the data. So one thing this means is that when I characterize a seller policy, a strategy, as optimal, that's conditional on the list price that was chosen by the human seller. Maybe if we had expanded the action space of the agent, what the agent would do instead is change the list price, but that's out of the scope of what we're doing here. Okay, so the data we use to train our simulator come from this incredible data set that was released alongside a recent QJE paper containing the universe of these best offer listings on eBay over a year-long period. It's nearly 100 million listings with uniquely, especially for a data set this size, complete offer histories for all buyer-seller interactions, regardless of whether the item sold. Okay, so we're going to make a number of restrictions here, the most important of which is that we're going to restrict the data to unique items. And the reason that we're doing that is because we want to restrict ourselves to items like the antique brass urn for which the market price is unclear. So you can think about what we're doing here is throwing out the iPhones for which there's a pretty clear market price. So in order to simulate a listing, we do the following. Okay, so we have a neural network that takes in all the fixed features of the listing, its list price, category, everything about the seller, and so on and so forth. And we use that neural net to predict a distribution of arrival times for the first buyer. Okay, and so from that distribution, we can draw an arrival time for the first buyer. We have another neural network that takes in those fixed features and the buyer's arrival time and predicts a distribution over their first offer, and we can draw a first offer from that conditional distribution, and so on and so forth. And in this way, we can simulate a listing until either the item sells or the listing expires. Okay. So what I want to convince you of is that our simulator is doing a pretty good job, and I'm going to do that in two ways. And the first way is to compare summary statistics between the data and these simulations. So here we're looking at one statistic, one variable, one feature, which is the normalized first offer. So on the horizontal axis, we have the first offer divided by the list price, and this is an empirical CDF. So the way to read this is if we look at the top right, we can see that this vertical bar of over 20% says that about 21, 22% of buyers, when they show up, they just click buy it now. Okay, other common first offers are for common fractions of the list price, so 4/5, 3/4, 3/5, so on and so forth. Very few, or relatively few, first offers are for less than half of the list price. Okay, so what I've overlaid here is a distribution of the first offers in our simulations. Okay, so all of this is coming from a holdout set of listings that weren't used to train the simulator. And to generate this blue curve, what we do is we loop over those listings and we simulate them once, and we can look in those simulations and calculate a distribution of those first offers. And the important thing to note is that these distributions are more or less coincident. So that's good. We can look at other summary statistics. So on the left, the number of threads or buyer-seller interactions per listing. Most everything on eBay is junk, and so the modal outcome is nobody shows up and the listing expires. Very rare that we get more than 2 buyers making offers on a given listing. On the right, the number of offers per thread. So we can go 7 turns deep, but that's relatively rare. The modal outcome is the buyer makes an offer and the seller responds. And if the seller responds with an accept, the listing is over, or perhaps they do something else and the buyer doesn't respond, and that's the end of the negotiation. Okay. So again, the distributions more or less match. So I could go through many of these charts, and I think a skeptical member in the audience might say, I'm cherry picking these results to find comparisons that look good, so let me try to do something else to convince you that our simulator is good. And that something else is a discriminator. So we train another neural network that observes a full thread, okay? So, and that thread is coming either from the data or the simulations, but the discriminator doesn't know which. So that thread has features that describe what the listing is and who the seller is, and those are the same regardless of where the thread is from. But it also has an offer path attached to it, and that offer path may and likely is different depending on whether the thread comes from the data or the simulations. Okay, and the goal is to predict whether the thread is real or simulated. So typically when we train a classifier, we want the classifier to do a good job at classification. And here we want our discriminator to have every chance of doing a good job at discriminating. But what we really want is for the discriminator to fail, because that will tell us that our simulated trajectories are doing a good job at mimicking the trajectories that we observe in the data. And that's more or less what we find. So the accuracy is a shade above the random guessing benchmark of 50%, which gives us confidence that our simulator is replicating the true data generating process. Okay, so hopefully if you buy into my claim that our simulator is good, now you can think about what the agent does as being meaningful. Okay, so a couple things up front about how we train it. So a bit of notation, the agent is a policy denoted pi that maps a set of features denoted x into a distribution over actions, where actions here are offers. We're going to initialize the seller strategy with random weights. This is a neural network, hence the deep and deep reinforcement learning. And these random weights are going to be such that regardless of the inputs, the agent is going to output more or less a uniform distribution over its potential actions at first. Okay, so then we're going to go into a new holdout set that we use to train the agent, and we're going to draw a listing, and we're going to keep from that listing all the features that describe the listing and the seller, and we're going to throw out everything about the offer path that was observed in real life. And we're going to use our simulator to say when buyers show up and what offers they make, but when it's time for the seller to respond, instead of using our simulated seller, we're going to use pi. Okay, so the agent is going to act randomly at first, but in step 3, it's going to get a payoff when the listing ends. And in step 4, we're going to do our reinforcement learning. We're going to update our policy to favor actions, or in this case, offers that lead to high payoffs. And we're going to repeat these steps 50 million times. Okay, so before I tell you what the agent is doing, I have to tell you what the agent is maximizing. And it's maximizing this payoff. So what is that payoff? So in the case in which the item sells, the payoff is clear. The seller doesn't have an antique brass urn anymore. They have some amount of money. Okay, so their payoff is whatever amount of money they have in their hand. The more tricky situation is, what if the item doesn't sell? Okay, so now they don't have money in their hand. They have this antique brass urn, and presumably this has some intrinsic value to the seller, but it's kind of unclear what that is. So whatever that value is, it's going to be discounted by some delta, which we're going to choose. It captures a bunch of different things: their impatience, some risk aversion, the staleness that may come when posting an item on eBay that doesn't sell. But we still have this pesky question, which is, what is that value? Okay, so this is a fundamental question in empirical bargaining research. It's the reason why most of empirical bargaining research is done in the lab, because in the lab you can randomly assign valuations to subjects. Obviously we can't do that, nor can we go and query these sellers as to how much do you really value your antique brass urn. So what we're going to do instead is something else. We're going to calculate a continuation value for each item by just simulating it many, many times. Okay, and then we're going to characterize optimal behavior under these values. Okay, so let me just be specific about all of this. The seller is maximizing their expected payoff. In the case in which the item sells, they get the sale price. In the case in which it doesn't sell, they get this discounted value. Okay, delta is a hyperparameter that we choose. And the way that we calculate the value is by simply replacing the expected payoff on the left with value, solving for value, and using the average sale price and the probability of a sale in many, many simulations of this item to calculate the exact value, the exact continuation value. Okay, so one thing to note is we don't give the agent the value itself, but it can infer that more or less from the features that it observes. Okay, so now we can look at some results. So here, this is what human sellers are doing. We have on the horizontal axis the normalized sale price, and this is, again, an empirical CDF. This is restricted in 2 ways. It's restricted to a separate holdout set that wasn't used, listings that weren't used to either train the simulator or the agent. And we're further restricting these listings to those for which the seller has an opportunity to respond. Okay, so this is true of everything I'm going to show you from henceforth. In particular, what we're doing is we're throwing out those instances in which nobody shows up, or for which the first buyer shows up and clicks buy it now. So in both of those circumstances, the seller doesn't have an opportunity to make an offer. Okay, but when the seller has an opportunity to make an offer, what happens? Well, you can see 20% of the time on the left, the item doesn't sell and the listing expires. So they don't accept, they do something else, and a sale is not reached. On the very right, we can see that about 7% of the time, the listing sells for the list price. Okay, but the vast majority of the time, the listing sells for something that's in between 0 and the list price. So we trained 2 agents. The first is an impatient agent that has a delta of 0. So what that means is that this agent really wants to sell the item. It gets nothing if the listing expires without a sale. Okay, a couple things to note. So on the left, see at the vertical axis, the y-axis, the intercept here is less than 10%. What that means is that this agent is really aggressive about selling. When it has the opportunity to accept or to make an offer, it does something that almost always leads to a sale. So it's only less than 10% of those cases where a sale is not achieved. But despite being so impatient, if we look on the right, it's nonetheless able to sell items for the list price about 22% of the time, 3 times as often as human sellers in the data. Okay? So it's motivated to sell, and yet it's somehow able to get the list price far more often than the human sellers that we observe in the data. We also train a patient agent, which has a delta of 0.75, and we choose 0.75 because this more or less equalizes the rate at which the patient agent and human sellers don't sell items for which they have an opportunity to make an offer. Okay, but on the right, you see that this patient agent is even more able to extract full value from these items that it does sell. It's selling 35% of them at full price, so 5 times as frequently as human sellers. So the basic dynamic is such, if you make the agent more impatient, they sell more items, and they sell, as a result, fewer of those items for the full list price, but they're still able to sell many more items for the full list price. So what these agents are doing is they're basically converting sales. You could think of them as converting sales that humans make at sub-list price values for the full list price. Okay, so when we saw this, we thought, oh, of course what's happening is these agents are just waiting for a buyer to come along that's willing to pay full price. And that turns out not to be true. So if you look at the distribution of first offers, they're the same regardless of whether the seller is a human or the impatient agent or a patient agent. Where we see separation is when we look at turn 3 offers. Okay, so turn 1 is the buyer's first offer, turn 2 is the seller's response, turn 3 is the buyer's response. We see here that very few offers to human sellers are for the full list price in turn 3, but there's something about what the sellers are doing, the agent sellers in turn 2, that elicits many more full price offers in turn 3. Okay, so let me tell you more about what's going on here. So every time you see a black line, it means we're looking at sellers in the data. Okay, so horizontal axis here is the same. It's the normalized first offer. On the left chart, I'm showing you the rate at which sellers reject those first offers. And on the right, the rate at which sellers accept those first offers. Okay, so what I'm not showing is the rate at which they counter. It's the complement of these probabilities. So as you move to the right on the horizontal axis, the first offer becomes more generous. And so, these human sellers are doing something that seems quite reasonable. You give me more money, I'm more likely to say, okay, let's do a deal. Okay, as we move right, the rate at which sellers reject decreases, the rate at which they accept increases. Okay, so I think that seems totally reasonable until you see what the agents are doing. Whoops. Which is the opposite. So focus on the reject rate, the chart on the left. The first thing to note is that the slope is positive. The more money you offer me as the buyer, you offer me more money, I'm more likely as the seller to say no. Okay, and these rejection rates are really quite high for very generous first offers. You offer me 90% of the list price. As the patient agent, I reject that more than 80% of the time. And as the impatient agent, I reject that more than 60% of the time, despite the fact that I get nothing if a sale does not materialize as the impatient agent. Okay, so why on earth is this happening? What are the agents doing? Okay, so the reason they're doing this is because generous first offers, high first offers, signal that the buyer has a high willingness to pay. Okay, you offer me 90% of the list price. What I should infer is that you really want my antique brass urn, and if I say no to you, you'll just pony up the full list price. And that's more or less what we see in the data. So horizontal axis is the same, the normalized first offer. The vertical axis now is the probability that the buyer accepts, that is, pays full price after the seller rejects in turn 2. So you come along and offer me half the list price in turn 1, and I say no, you're unlikely to pay full price thereafter. But if you offer me 80, 90% of the list price, and I say no, you're going to be pretty likely to pay full price right afterwards. Okay, and the reason why this rejection strategy works so well, and this is the last analysis that I'll show before opening up the floor to questions, is because rejections communicate that the list price is firm. Okay, so how can we see that in the data? So again, the last chart and these charts are all just analyses from the data. We're restricting here to instances in which the first offer is exactly 2/3 of the list price. Horizontal axis is the seller's response. Okay, so on this chart, we're showing you responses that range from 3/4 of the list price all the way to a rejection that says, no, the list price is firm. Look at the line. So as we move left on the horizontal axis, what happens is the probability that the buyer says okay increases, which makes a lot of sense. As I, as a seller, make a larger concession to the buyer in response to their first offer, the buyer is more likely to accept. But I think the interesting part of this chart is on the right, this discontinuity that happens between small concessions and a rejection. So small concessions almost never elicit an acceptance, but a rejection here elicits a full price offer by the buyer 15% of the time. That grows if we look at instances in which the first offer is exactly 3/4 of the list price. Here, a rejection induces the buyer to pay full price about 1/3 of the time. And finally, if we look at first offers that are exactly 4/5 of the list price, we see that a rejection induces the buyer to pay full price about half the time, whereas small concessions will rarely, if ever, induce full price offers. Okay, so what's happening here? I think a reasonable interpretation is if you as a seller make a small concession, it signals to the buyer that you're willing to negotiate, that the price is not firm. But if you reject, that's a strong signal to the buyer that no, if you want to buy this item, you need to pay full price. And I think this is all the more remarkable and surprising to us in light of the fact that the make offer button is optional. So when the seller creates their listing, they can choose to just have a fixed price listing where the only possible way to buy the item is for the list price, or they can include the make offer button. So you would think that by including the make offer button, they're signaling to the buyer that the list price is in fact negotiable. But simply rejecting the buyer's first offer, even with that make offer button, is a credible way to signal to the buyer that no, in fact, the list price is firm. Okay, so thank you so much. Let me stop here. I'd be happy to take a couple questions.
Hi. Nice talk. And my question is, do you have information about the speed of rejections or acceptance? And does that affect your those CDF curves?
So basically, all offers need to come within 48 hours. That's the time limit that eBay sets. And for the seller, the vast majority of responses come within a couple hours and typically some number of minutes. So we didn't parse kind of small differences in those response times, given kind of the distribution, that very tight distribution of response times. Yes?
Hey, so my question is, how can you be sure that the simulation is accurate after the modified agent is making different responses after turns 1, 3, and 5? If the humans don't usually make those responses, then the discriminator test wouldn't be able to tell that the simulator is not being accurate on these rare outcomes.
Sorry, could you just come closer to the mic? I can't.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, so how are you sure that the simulator is being accurate after you've changed the turn 1, 3, and 5 responses if the humans don't usually make these responses, then the discriminator wouldn't be able to see this in the two data versus simulation it's comparing.
Yeah, well, I mean, if I understand your question right, I think that's a circumstance that the discriminator would be able to use to do a good job of discriminating. I think your question is basically if the negotiation veered off the path that we observed in the data, how would we be able to tell whether the simulator is doing a good job? Yeah, right, so I mean, the discriminator is not going to test for those circumstances because they happen in sample. So, right, so I think you're getting at kind of like one of the fundamental limitations that this approach has, which is that you need to constrain the agent to basically maneuver within the range of the data. Otherwise, the simulator is going to give you kind of some perhaps junk response. So I didn't go into the ways in which we do that, but we have a number of ways of basically making sure that the offers that the seller makes are sort of within the distribution of the data. And so two of those are we limit it to kind of common fractional offers that are observed in the data. And the second is we don't allow the seller to choose its response time. We just draw the response time from the simulated seller. It's not perfect, and I think kind of the best test of this would be to launch this agent on eBay and see what types of rewards it generates, and if there's kind of a big gap, then it may be due to a concern like yours. Thanks. Yes?
Hey, thanks, that was very interesting. I was curious, there's this work, this Backus, Blake, and Tadelis work on how if you post round numbers as your offer price on eBay, then like a round number, the theory is signals more willingness to negotiate, and the exact number signals more firm offer. And I guess since you're working with exact numbers, in principle, that could show up in the strategies the agent learns. Is that showing up, or is that somehow orthogonal to what you're doing?
I mean, we had to make a number of design choices, to make this thing tractable. And one of the design choices we made is to redefine offers as concessions, as fractional values between the two previous offers.
Okay.
And in doing so, we abstracted away from round or non-round offers. So I think that's a super interesting question for which our paper has nothing to say.
Thanks.
Hi, I just wanted to echo the question from the virtual room. So I can't actually read it from here because I'm too far away, but you can look on the screen and maybe read it out loud.
Yeah, okay, so great question. So you can think of an offer as a three-part tuple. So it's when you make the offer, it's the price you offer, and it's whether you include a message with your offer, and if so, what the content of that message is. We're handicapped on the message point because while we observe an indicator in the data for whether a message was attached to an offer, we don't observe the content of that message. Messages are not that frequent, and so what we do is we just restrict the agent from making any messages at all because we can't possibly say what should be included in that message. And so kind of all the performance results that you're seeing are conditional on that handicap. But potentially you can do better if you attach a message to your offer, and maybe the offer strategy that you use differs when you're including messages from when you're not. Hi.
Oh, is this work? Okay. One question on the training of the simulator. If I understand correctly, you train this simulator as a supervised learning problem and only validate with the discriminator.
That's right.
Could you train the whole system at once?
Yeah, as a GAN.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I think you could. I haven't worked with GANs, and we were super hesitant to do so for two reasons. One, sort of anecdotes from people who have suggested that it can be quite unstable. And second, the typical setting in which you train a GAN is to generate images. And with images, you can look at the output and say, is that realistic or not? Here, we can't do that. So we could train a GAN, but it would be very difficult to say, that this just converges to a local optimum in which it's not doing a very good job of generating kind of realistic trajectories, or are these trajectories that truly mimic the data generating process? So we didn't do that. Thanks so much.